For a long time, I thought being well-read meant reading the right books, not the books I was curious about, the books that counted, the classics, the prize winners, the ones that prove you're serious. And I didn't question this, but at some point, I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't reading to understand, and I wasn't reading to fulfill myself. I was reading to impress. I was reading to prove something. And once that thought entered my mind, it really changed everything about the way that I read. I used to believe that serious readers stay close to the canon, not necessarily reading only classics, but close enough that no one could question their legitimacy or their seriousness. That meant that science fiction, crime novels, fantasy, graphic novels, those things belong somewhere else. They're imaginative. They maybe even be ambitious or experimental, but they're definitely not serious. And I think a lot of us absorb this kind of judgmental hierarchy without ever really considering it and without being aware that we've adopted it. Culturally, we have to admit that certain books signal taste. They signal education, and they signal participation in a certain kind of cultural conversation. This is the idea of cultural capital, that taste signals status, and it also gives us a form of status. And once we see that, it's hard to unsee it, that some books are not just books, they're actually credentials. And once reading becomes visible, and we're in a time now where reading is very visible, like almost all aspects of our life, this is kind of an unfortunate byproduct of social media, but also we've become a kind of society that does things a lot more publicly than ever before. And that means that things can become evaluated. And along with that evaluation, there starts to be kind of a pressure that goes with that, a pressure to read certain kinds of books, to read the right books. Now, the canon is vast. Okay, and it keeps expanding, and that's what it should do. That's kind of the way that a canon works, right? There's always another foundational text that you haven't read. There's always a new major author that suddenly needs to be read, or needs to be given kind of significance or legitimacy. And there's always a book that everyone starts to casually reference that you may not have read. So you're always going to be a little bit behind if you start to look at reading this way. And with that comes a sort of low-grade sense of incompletion or a sense of failure. And that can influence and change the way that you read. You're going to stop asking, what am I curious about? You stop asking, what do I want to read? And you start asking, what should I read? Or what should someone like me have read by now to be considered a reader? Okay. And that means that a kind of audience has entered the room along with you as you're reading. So your reading kind of becomes split then, or it kind of becomes divided. Part of you is reading the book, but another part is monitoring the choice of book and asking, will this count? Is this the right book? Will this sound impressive? Here's the part that we don't really say out loud. Okay. If you've ever felt the flicker of embarrassment for loving a so-called unserious book, if you've ever kind of softened or toned down your enthusiasm when someone asked what you were reading because you weren't reading a serious book, okay, if you've ever powered or pushed through a classic that you didn't connect with at all, just so you could say that you did, then you know that this isn't abstract, that this is real. This is kind of a very personal thing. And it can mean that your reading life is not really guided then by curiosity. You're not trying to fulfill something within inside yourself. It's actually kind of guided by a certain type of fear. And that's a fear of not being taken seriously. It's a fear of being seen as shallow. It's a fear of not participating in the right conversation. And that fear, again, shapes how you choose books, and it shapes the books that you read. You push through books that don't hold you because you think that if you abandon those books, that's a kind of sense of failure, that you're going to be judged, that you're not a real reader then. So you're reading to complete rather than to connect. And I think that over time, what happens is you distrust your own taste. And I think that that's actually a really terrible terrible thing. You need to trust your own taste. You need to trust your own instincts as a reader. Now, for me personally, I didn't kind of really come to terms with this or recognize this until I went back to college. I went to college kind of late in my 30s. And when I was in college, I was already an adult. I already had kind of my own tastes developed. And there was a graphic novel that kind of helped me come to terms with this. And it's this. It was V for Vendetta. I read this a long time ago, and I've reread it multiple times. And this book really changed the way that I think about being a serious reader. And maybe you've read this book too, so maybe you can relate to some of this. So at the time that I read this, graphic novels are not really considered serious books. I think even now there's kind of starting to be accepted as serious, but still generally not, they're kind of considered part of pop culture, not necessarily part of literary culture. And so I felt kind of defensive about picking it up and about reading it. And it was kind of a time when I was studying humanities and writing, and I felt that I needed to justify, what I was reading. But I read this, and I absolutely loved it. I've never read anything like it before, and I don't think I've read anything like it ever since. It's one of those books that you're always kind of comparing things to. It's one of those stories that you're always comparing other stories to, and it's kind of like a benchmark for me. I'd never read anything like this. I didn't know you could write a story like this that could be touching on so many levels and powerful on so many levels and do operate on so many levels. It's emotional, it's political, psychological, sociological, and it's unmistakably serious. It confronts authoritarianism. It confronts surveillance. It confronts moral compromise. It confronts political violence. It confronts manipulating people emotionally to achieve your own goals. And it does all these things directly, and it does all of them without apology. It doesn't soften any edges. It's a bit extreme, but it's not an escapist story. It's a highly concentrated and actually very realistic story. And by constructing the dystopian world within the story, it strips away the ambiguity that I think a lot of literary and canon fiction uses, and it forces political and ethical tensions right out into the open. As a reader, you cannot avoid those topics. They are right there on the page. You have to deal with it. And, somewhere in the middle of reading this book, I felt something that I didn't really expect. And that was a kind of disorientation because the hierarchy of, what is serious and what are good books, I had internalized that, and suddenly it didn't hold. I couldn't apply it to this book. It just didn't work anymore. So I had kind of quietly categorized it as unserious, and yet it was doing more intellectual and moral and emotional work than many of the important novels that I was being assigned to read. I mean, I admired those novels from a distance, and I acknowledged that they were important and achievements, but I didn't really like them. They just didn't do much for me. And that realization exposed something uncomfortable. It isn't that genre fiction lacks seriousness. It was that I needed genre fiction to be unserious. And I just had it all backwards. I had it all wrong. And I realized that, the hierarchy, that sort of sense of judgment of what's good and what's serious, it wasn't an aesthetic. It was social. I hadn't been protecting standards. I'd been protecting status and status quo. And that's a really difficult thing to come to terms with. It's difficult to admit, because it meant that my reading life hadn't been shaped by choice and by discernment and by curiosity, but it had been shaped by fear and wanting to be perceived as a serious reader. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't ignore that. Because the problem wasn't that I had just misjudged genre. The problem was that I had confused prestige with seriousness. Now, those two things can overlap, but they're not the same. Prestige is social. Prestige is about recognition. Seriousness is about depth. And once I was able to kind of recognize the separation of those two as a reader, something inside of me kind of broke free, something kind of loosened a little bit. And I realized that seriousness isn't something that lives on a shelf. It's a quality of attention that I bring to something as I read. Seriousness is not a genre, it's a mode of thinking. A book is serious if it demands sustained thought, if it complicates or questions your assumptions, if it lingers, and if it sticks with you over time, if you keep kind of thinking about it over time, if it keeps coming up again and again. Science fiction can make us question and understand technological and social power structures and imbalances. Crime fiction exposes injustices. Fantasy helps us externalize and even visualize moral conflicts. And, graphic narratives, graphic novels, these can compress political arguments into imaginative and very visual forms and do these very effectively and very quickly in ways that words maybe could not do. So category tells us very little about the depth of a book. The question you want to ask isn't, is this prestigious? You want to ask, am I paying attention? When you override your own curiosity repeatedly, I think something inside of you kind of fossilizes and stiffens and even decays. You hesitate before reaching for what genuinely interests you. You internalize the idea that your instinct needs correction or it needs guidance. And therefore, your reading becomes more of an evaluation. And your bookshelf possibly becomes a kind of display. And reading then becomes a kind of signal. And when that happens, reading stops being a conversation between your mind and the author's mind or even another reader's mind. And instead, it just becomes a performance for others to observe and assess and evaluate and judge. I think that reading is one of the few remaining activities that can belong entirely to your interior life, to your interior mind and your interior soul. And it's a sustained conversation between your mind and your soul and your brain and another person's, whether that's the author or another reader or a community of readers who are reading the same book or reading the same kinds of things. And I think that when that space kind of becomes taken over by these kind of hierarchies and these judgments, then something narrows with that and something really gets lost. And that's something that is very important. So instead of asking, what is a book doing to you or how is a book changing you, you start wondering, what does the book say about you? Or how will others perceive me when I say I've read this book? Will I be taken seriously as a reader? And it's very important to understand that that's kind of a dangerous road to go down as a reader. Now, I don't think that the solution is to reject the canon. Obviously, I would never think that that's the right thing to do. The canon is very valuable. We can learn a lot from it, but it should not function as a kind of test or as a requirement. And it should definitely not become a sort of gateway or a barrier that keeps certain people out and certain people in. That's horrible and a totally wrong thing to do. Being well read is not about proximity to prestige. It's about the quality of attention that you bring to what you read and about the quality of the discussion that you have after you read a book or even while you're reading a book. That's what quality and being well read is really all about. So, when I stopped reading for prestige, I'm going to freely admit there was a period of time in my life where I've read for prestige, and I've kind of gone in and out of that mode several times where I do kind of sometimes want to read something to say that I've read it. But when I stop doing that, when I move away from that, I find that I read more widely and I read more deeply than I ever would if I just stuck with what I thought of as kind of reading for prestige. So here's something to consider. Strip away the audience. Imagine no one will see what you're reading. Imagine you're not going to make videos. You're not going to talk to anyone about what you read. Imagine that no one is going to ask you what you're reading, okay? And no one's going to ask, how many books have you read this year either? So if you take all those things away, what book will you choose next? And how would your reading change? Would you go down a different path as a reader? I would love to know in the comments how that might change your reading, or maybe it wouldn't change it. Maybe you've broken free of this already. Maybe this isn't an issue for you. If that's the case, tell me also, and tell me, how did you break away from that pressure? I'd really love to hear other people's experiences with this kind of idea of reading for prestige and how it can ruin your reading. So if you're interested in thinking more deeply about reading, about culture, and about the inner life, consider subscribing, because that's what this channel is all about.